Welcome to another episode of Entitled People by Tail Square, where we unpack stories about those who think rules don't apply to them and the world revolves around them. Up next, how my aunt's selfish choices came back to haunt her. How my entitled late aunt lost everything. Buckle up because this story is an absolute whirlwind that spans nearly 4 years. Some background relevant to the story. In December of 2020, my father agreed to put his mother into a nursing home to protect his sister, my aunt, from an elder abuse investigation and getting my grandmother moved into state care. Due to my aunt's negligence, my grandmother had been hospitalized 3 times in 2 months. Once for a severe UTI, another time for an infected wound because my aunt secured my grandmother's diaper with duct tape, and the final time because of second-degree burns after my aunt left a heating pad on my grandmother's back overnight. Ironically, in October 2021, my aunt would end up in a nursing home after she burned herself with a heating pad, then didn't seek medical treatment until the burn was badly infected. In January 2022, my grandmother passed away at the age of 94. In my grandparents' will, they split their estate 50-50 between their 2 children. However, because neither my father nor my aunt was on the deed to my grandparents' house, it was signed over to a probate lawyer who would be tasked with selling the house. When my father started going through his mother's affairs in February 2022, he discovered that the state was on the verge of taking the house because the only bills my aunt bothered paying were the electric and cable bills. She hadn't paid property taxes since December 2020. My father also discovered 2 massive lands on the house totaling almost $200,000. One was from the nursing home my grandmother had been in because my aunt hadn't paid them either. The other was because my aunt convinced my grandmother to take a home equity loan out on the house so she could buy a car. Initially, she was only supposed to take what she needed for the car, roughly $6,000. However, my aunt went behind my grandmother's back and took the full $100,000 the bank offered. My aunt had co-signed the loan, so she was authorized to take the full amount. She never made any of the monthly payments on the loan because she legitimately thought loans were money banks give people for free, no strings attached. My aunt never told anyone what she did with the remaining $94,000, but the rest of the family suspects she gambled it away at local casinos. My aunt was also given full access to my grandmother's bank account, which she had almost completely drained before my grandmother passed. This meant my father had to pay any outstanding bills out of his own pocket, though he was eventually reimbursed by the lawyer. At some point between late January 2022 and March 2022, in an attempt to buy herself time to recover enough to leave the nursing home and thinking the house couldn't be sold if someone was living in it, my aunt convinced one of her friends to move into my grandmother's vacant house without informing my father or the lawyer. As you can imagine, things got messy when my father found out. Initially, my aunt told my father that the man was there to take care of her 2 cats. But even after my aunt was court-ordered to sign her 2 cats over to my father due to neglect and abuse, the man refused to leave. Both cats were treated, rehomed, and are doing well. We eventually found out he had broken his lease, moved out of his apartment, and had nowhere else to go except his and my aunt's daughter's house, but she adamantly refused to let him move in with her. Around April, my parents started to deep clean the disgustingly dirty house with the man still living there, and he did everything in his power to obstruct my parents' efforts. He'd call it claiming he was sick with COVID, which my parents almost always called his bluff on since he was physically disabled, never left the house, and had no visitors except my parents. One day, he told my mother, "Well, Sharon, EA, said we'd be able to live here forever," and that my father didn't have the guts to kick me out. My mom told my father what had been said, and the very next day my father gave the man an ultimatum. Either you leave on your own by May 1st, or I'll have you evicted. The man chose the eviction route because my aunt told him they can't legally evict a disabled person, and he believed her. He ended up moving in with his daughter, who is no longer speaking to my aunt because my aunt has ruined that woman's livelihood on multiple occasions, but that's a whole other story. Before he left the house, per my aunt's orders, he stole several valuable pieces of jewelry, including a box of rings willed to her cousins. We were able to get the stolen jewelry back in late 2023 after the probate lawyer had to send police to retrieve it, which is another story in itself. Because of the squatter situation, we missed a massive housing boom where houses were selling for significantly more than they were worth, and the house was put on the market during a slump, selling for almost $150,000 less than what it was worth. This led to another lengthy legal battle with my aunt because she refused to sell or throw out any of her furniture, in another attempt to buy enough time to leave the nursing home until she was court-ordered to do so. Given what the house sold for and after deducting the lien from the home equity loan, the lien from the nursing home had been dismissed by a judge. My father ended up with just under $60,000, while my aunt ended up with just under $50,000. My aunt received less because the probate lawyer charged her more than he charged my father, as she was the one who had dragged things out. Around that time, my aunt was deemed unfit to make decisions for herself by a judge and several doctors and ended up signing her half of the inheritance over to my father to avoid losing it to the nursing home she was in. My aunt passed away on August 1st at the age of 68 from multi-organ failure caused by years of heavy smoking, ignoring her diabetes, and refusing surgery that likely would have saved her life. We didn't have a funeral for her. We simply had her cremated, and her ashes, along with pictures and other personal belongings, were given to her older daughter. My aunt's younger daughter tried to sue my father for the rest of her mother's inheritance, but the suit was quickly dropped since my aunt had already signed her inheritance over to my father, so my aunt's daughter had no right to it. Our one saving grace in this whole fiasco was that my aunt was in a nursing home for the entire process. Otherwise, it would have been even messier. There's a lot I didn't cover for the sake of not turning this into a novel, but I'm happy to elaborate on anything. Karen insults pastor's daughter and gets embarrassed. This story I'm about to tell happened several years ago, and I only just remembered it after seeing the said Karen at the grocery store. Small heads up, I've got a terrible memory, so the specifics are going to be a little fuzzy. For some background, this takes place in a small town church in the Midwest. I know y'all already have some red flags raised, but it wasn't all that bad. In fact, it was quite nice. Most of the people who attended were really nice older folks. There was only a handful of people there under their 30s. I was easily the youngest person there, and I think I was 13 or 14 at the time. Anyway, I suppose I should introduce the main character of the story, the pastor's daughter. Let's call her Samantha. I think this was around the time she graduated from high school. She was awesome. She actually acted as the church's Sunday school teacher, even though I was the only one attending LOL. She always snuck me a second granola bar during snack time. A big thing to know about Samantha, she was a lesbian. I'm not kidding. She even had a girlfriend at the time, whom she brought to church with her. Now, before anyone gets worried for her, she seemed fine. Nobody was up in arms about her sexuality. Aside from the occasional disapproving look from one of the regulars, nobody really said anything. I do remember one conversation Samantha had with the church bus driver, who said he was disappointed about her choice in partners, but that was it. Nobody spoke a mean word about her. That is, until this Karen showed up. She was new in town. She had come to our church around winter-ish. You know that stereotype about the super evangelical lady? She was exactly that. She was loud, a bit overweight, and wore a fancy Sunday dress and hat. She was easily the most fancily dressed person there. She also had 2 kids, a baby boy and a teenage girl. I wasn't really paying much attention to her, though I could definitely hear her hemming and hawing about something. Anyway, the story begins during service. Samantha had brought her girlfriend at the time, and Karen and her family were a couple pews behind them. Just before the incident took place, I was passing around the donations dish. I distinctly remember she was glaring daggers at the back of Samantha and her girlfriend's heads as she dropped some cash into the dish. The pastor, who I'll call John, was giving his sermon when the incident happened. I heard Karen screech, which scared the life out of me. I think Samantha and her girlfriend might have snuggled too close together, not sure. Anyway, the whole church fell silent in shock as Karen proceeded to go on the biggest homophobic rant I've ever heard. I actually learned a slur or two because of it. She was demanding that Samantha and her girlfriend be thrown out of the church. The whole place was silent for a moment before Pastor John cleared his throat and spoke. I can't remember everything he said, but there is one part of his speech I remember so distinctly that it's made me respect him ever since. My daughter's sexual orientation does not change the love I have for her, nor does it diminish the worth that God has endowed her with. She is made in the image of God, as we all are, and her worth is inherent and unassailable. To suggest otherwise is to misunderstand the very essence of our faith, which is rooted in love, grace, and acceptance. Aspects that seems you don't uphold yourself. It was like he was handing down the word of God. By the end of it, everybody was giving her a disapproving glare. Karen's daughter looked like she wanted to sink into the floor, the baby was crying, and Karen was legit purple. She screamed something about this place being a false temple, and how we would all burn for defending this insert slur, before storming out. I could legit hear her peeling out of the parking lot. After that, I think the rest of the churchgoers softened towards Samantha. I distinctly remember this one older couple asking Samantha and her girlfriend about LGBTQ issues a couple weeks after the incident. Entitled neighbor demands we extend our wall, and threatens to report us to the city. I've lived in this house with my grandparents for about 6 years. When we moved in, there was this awful wooden retaining wall facing the neighbor's property. Her property is downhill from ours, so the retaining wall keeps our yard from eroding into hers. Last year, we found out the wall was rotting and needed to be replaced, so we recently had it redone with beautiful retaining stones. We also extended the wall beyond where the previous one had been. We couldn't take it all the way to the street because of city guidelines, but it goes far enough. It could be extended by maybe 3 feet, but we couldn't afford to go farther. Well, the neighbor, who we had gotten along with until now, didn't like it. She complained that our wall wasn't long enough and that her yard was going to wash away. She said she already had rivers running through her yard. We live on a street with no sidewalks, so everyone has ditches for drainage. She never cleans hers, despite having huge trees dropping sticks and leaves into it. so her yard floods when it rains. She's blaming us for that. She then offered to pay the landscapers to extend the wall and showed my grandma some brown retaining stones she said she could get to finish the wall. Our wall is gray, so of course Grandma said no. The neighbor said she couldn't deal with it and didn't want to be difficult but would report us to the city if she had to. My grandma said, "Go ahead," and walked away. What makes her think she has any right to mess with our wall? Our landscapers even removed a stump from her property for free. She asked them if they could, and she never even thanked them. As far as we know, she either hasn't reported us to the city, or the city told her to mind her own business. She's tried to make conversation with me, but I won't talk to her. I have too much going on without having her trying to manipulate me into talking to my grandma. Edit to add some clarification. Her yard has had water issues since before we moved in, she told us that, so it wasn't caused by our new wall. The new wall was installed by professionals, and it has a proper drainage system. None of the damage she pointed out could have been caused by our new wall. We know this because it hadn't rained between the wall being finished and her complaint, so there was no storm water for our wall to drain into her yard. Plus, the damage was on the other side of her yard, nowhere near our wall. She never mentioned the water damage in her yard until she started demanding we extend the wall. If she had, we might have replaced it sooner. The landscapers did get her permission to go onto her property to build the wall. It's not on her property, but they needed to use her yard to install everything properly. She was fine with it as long as they fixed her yard afterward, which they did. She confirmed it looked great. We got all the proper permits and followed regulations, so there's really nothing she can do at this point.